Most of us have had experiences of this sort, incidents in which we were keenly aware something wasn't right, that we were in the presence of something we could not explain, but more often they remain unspoken, memories of rooms we have bolted from, or of moments of stark terror in the darkness. Sometimes, though, they take on another, more formal shape, becoming stories about inexplicable encounters and intimations of the supernatural. These stories take different forms, but most often they are ritualized as what we think of as ghost stories. I have heard many such stories over the years. One took place in a hospital in Brisbane, where a friend of mine and her family were gathered at the bedside of her dying grandfather, and involved a mysterious visitor to their bedside and a phone call a few minutes after their grandfather's death, in which a voice assured them that their grandfather would be fine, because he's in a better place now. Another involved my brother, and a little girl he spoke to in a hallway in a hotel who could not have been there. My favorite is a story an old family friend called Alan told me several years ago. Alan is in his 70s now, but at the time of the story he was still a young man and had taken a job as one of a team of researchers working in an Aboriginal settlement in the Central Desert. After a year or so of this, two of the men offered to take Alan to meet an elder who lived 2 days' drive from a township, and to visit a series of sacred sites along the way. Alan agreed, and so, a few days later, the three of them set off together into the desert. As anyone who has spent time in Central Australia will know, the desert is a strange place, and one that can easily unsettle the unwary. Alan has spoken more than once of places he did not care for, or that seemed somehow haunted, not the least of which was an archaeological dig in the necropolis of Lake Mungo, where many thousands of Aboriginal dead lied buried beneath the sand. Yet his trip quickly became particularly odd. Early on, the first day, a mob of kangaroos they were following hopped off the track and disappeared, and later, on a hillside, they 3 times sighted a sacred site they meant to visit and set off down to it, only to find it had vanished, an experience Alan still had no explanation for. Come dusk, they were approaching a low, rounded hill, and though Alan could tell it was a place the men he was with were uncomfortable about, they directed him to stop, and together the 3 made camp for the night. Like all dreaming beliefs, the dreaming beliefs of the Eerie people are complex, and inseparable from the land they describe and sustain. The dreaming is a place of power and myth, a world pressed close against this one, and dreaming sites are those places where the two worlds meet. Those that live on the other side, in the dreaming, are not evil, but nor are they safe to be around. They are creatures of power with their own agenda and meanings. As they ate, the men told Alan that on the other side of a hill there lay a dreaming campsite. As they sat there around the fire, they could hear the cries of a wind. Sounds the men said were those of the dingoes around the camp on the hill's other side. Both were uneasy, and it was, as Alan himself admitted, an unsettling night. Very cold, with a freezing wind blowing low across the land. Much later, Alan awoke. The wind had dropped and it was still, but looking up from his sleeping bag, he could see the clouds overhead moving fast against the stars. Rising, he stepped past the sleeping forms of his companions and the fire, now little more than embers, and walked out into the darkness, looking for somewhere to piss. Now, the wind was gone. It was very quiet and bitterly cold. And then, quite suddenly, he felt fear grip him. Not fear of the dark or of being lost, but a primal, physical fear. On his neck and arms the hair stood up, panic gripping him in the gut as he turned and ran back to the campsite. In the morning, they all woke early. Alan's companions seemed as eager as he was to be quit of the place, and so they were on the road before the sun was fully up. With a hill behind him, he felt easier, and although he did not forget the experience, it faded, and, aware how foolish it sounded, he never mentioned it to anyone, at least not until he returned to the township for a visit several years later. And then, quite by accident, the subject of that trip came up. The two men who had been with him looked uncomfortable and curious. Alan asked them why. "That was a bad trip," one of them said. "A lot of strange things happened." "Like what?" Alan asked. "The kangaroos?" He nodded. "The kangaroos, and that night by the hill." Suddenly uneasy, Alan asked him what he meant, and after a moment the man asked him if he remembered the dreaming campsite. When Alan told him he did, the man paused again, and said they too had awoken in the night, only they had not seen Alan in the darkness beyond the fire. They had seen him in the moonlight on the hill, speaking to two of the dreaming men. "And then?" Alan asked. "And then we were so frightened we covered our heads up and waited for the morning." Good evening, and welcome to the Eerie Hour, the most cursed podcast on the internet. What I just read to you was an excerpt from an article from the literary magazine Meanjin titled Encounters with the Uncanny by James Bradley. I've just gotten off my voyage, so Patrick and I are going to discuss personal scary stories. So it's really quite hot in this room because my fan sounds like a Ju-87 coming in for a dive bombing run, and so I'm just going to have to suffer for my art a little bit. Patrick, can you confirm that you have not indeed been hit by a brick within the last 20 or so minutes?
I can confirm that, indeed.
Well, that's a positive sign, because that was a real concern for me, because he had accidentally opened himself up to interference by the universe in creating an ironic situation by stating that in the next 20 or 30 minutes he won't be hit by a brick, preventing him from recording. So, Patrick, I wanted to do this show because of something that occurred really recently that I think just had to be told. But before we get into that, do you have any scary encounters to tell?
Not really. I haven't had, unfortunately, anything too supernatural happen to me. When you told me to think about it, I thought about it, and I haven't really had that many spooky ghost experiences.
How about the cat food?
Ah, yes. So, yeah,
Yeah,
I was wondering
you
if I,
tell us.
I was wondering if I had told you about that.
You told me, and I feel somewhat insulted that you would tell me you had no
Oh,
supernatural
actually,
encounters, having told me the cat food story.
yeah, and there's another thing about that was weird too because
Well, I think you should probably
well,
at least tell the good
yes.
people what the cat food story is.
So, one night or one morning, I should say, I went to give my cat some cat food and noticed that overnight a bunch of cat food had gone missing somehow. And no one had broken into my apartment or anything. It would have been impossible.
A cat food bandit of sorts.
And it's such a weird thing. Like, why would someone come into my apartment and only take cat food? But
And,
the
like,
same.
how significant a quantity of cat food are we speaking here?
It was like a box full of these cans of cat food that are the most horrific smelling things ever. I don't know how cats eat those things, but that's the same night that happened, my neighbor's cat who lived in an apartment like right beside mine started freaking out and acting weird, and for the next few days it was all freaked out and wouldn't come out of hiding and stuff.
Wow. Yeah,
So it was a weird cat ghost thing going on there.
that's pretty, honestly. I don't know why that story stuck with me so much. It's just something so inexplicable. Like, if a paranormal entity were to exist, why wouldn't it just mess with cat food and do mundane stuff like that? You know?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah,
Malicious ghost.
yeah, totally. Like a cat food poltergeist. Anyway, aside from that, I guess I'm gonna tell you what I came on
The
to
good stuff.
tell. Yes, the good
Yeah.
stuff indeed. So, this was very recent, within the last couple of weeks, but it wasn't as such something paranormal that happened to me, rather interesting discussion I had with some people. So, it
Hmm.
was about 10 p.m. at night where I was in the top bunk of my dorm room in the pitch black working on an assignment due the next day with my headphones in and just listening to music. And suddenly I start to hear someone talking to me at the side of my bed, right? So I
Hmm.
look, and there, these two guys who had just walked into my room unannounced and uninvited, who had listened to the second episode of a podcast, which was human hunting.
Hmm.
And as any dignified man would do, I asked them to vacate the room in a hasty manner, although in more colourful language than that, obviously. This is not the frightening part of the story, obviously, but it kind of is at the same time, because I say this podcast is cursed for a reason, and really, in this instance, I brought upon myself the curse of being burdened by these two fellows that had entered my room. And so, although I was understandably somewhat baffled why these guys would see it fit to just walk into my room like that, they know who they are, and I can guarantee they are listening to this. Please, if you're going to enter the room, at least warn me beforehand. Anyways, they start discussing with me the podcast episode, which had just been released, episode 2 on human hunting. I start to actually enjoy talking to them, which is something that I hadn't anticipated.
Yeah.
So we start talking more broadly about paranormal topics when we begin talking about personal scary stories, right? And they ask me
Hmm.
if I have had any of my own. So I recount to them the following story. So one night, a few years ago, I was sat in my bedroom alone. The two-story house I was in was empty, both my parents away on work-related activities. It was around 9 p.m., so it was dark outside. Whenever I was home alone in this house, scary stuff always seemed to happen. I'm lying there on my laptop when I hear my father's voice coming from downstairs near the side entrance. I'm glad my father's home, so I leap up to go meet him downstairs. While I didn't think of it at the time, I hadn't heard the distinctive sound of my father's car going down the driveway, which I would normally hear quite clearly if he was pulling into the driveway from my bedroom. I reach the bottom of the stairs facing the side entrance of the house, expecting to see my father there, but there's no one there. At this point, I'm somewhat confused. I yell to my father, "Hey Dad!" I get no answer, just the still night air permeating the room. At this point, somewhat unsettled, I repeat again, "Hey Dad!" this time louder. Still nothing. I stand there for 2 seconds before running back to my room, at this point, completely panicked, and lock myself in my room, armed with a knife. Nothing is seen or heard for the rest of the night. My parents return about half an hour later, and I relay the story to them. No, I don't necessarily attribute this experience to paranormal activity, but more likely my anxious personality and experiencing an auditory hallucination because I was anxious due to being home alone at night. But at the time it felt astoundingly real, and part of me wants to believe it was like a mimic though, or like a skinwalker. So on a side note, this was actually pretty freaky that would happen in this house. Cars would always pull up in the driveway at night when I was home alone, which was pretty weird.
Mm-hmm.
Like black cars, black vans. And like, not even joking, that was really freaky. And it's not even a case of like I heard them, I saw them, like, and this happened pretty much every time I was home alone at night. It was pretty weird. We had like we think it was like burglars or something weird like that, but anyway.
Yeah.
So
Well, there have been haunted cars before. There's a police chase where these cops are chasing this car, and it inexplicably kind of goes through a fence that the cops aren't able to go through, and goes off into the distance, and they were never able to catch it. And this whole thing's on camera on YouTube.
That sounds pretty good. I'll have to, if you can find that, I'll link it in the description. But I don't attribute that to like Men in Black or anything, or like paranormal activity, but I thought that may be interesting to note. Anyway, this opened up the discussion more broadly to paranormal experience by other people there, so there were obviously my other roommates in the room, which makes it even more rude that they would just walk in unannounced, also at 10 p.m. when we were just about getting to sleep. But anyway, while they acknowledged sort of
content.
What, sorry?
I said at least they had good content.
Yeah, they had excellent content. Very well, not so much them themselves, but what they incited here is what I'm going to tell you about. So while they acknowledged the scary nature of the story, it completely overshadowed by the next story relayed by my roommate, a person of Australian Aboriginal descent named Tyrese. So us talking about paranormal encounters had caused him to remember something that he had been trying to suppress for a long time. Aboriginal Australians are a deeply spiritual people in many aspects, with a similar notion of connection to the land as you have with Native Americans around your area, right? So now he comes from a community in the remote Australian outback. He is not from around the town at all. He is from a very remote Australian community in the outback. And
when you say remote, like you mean remote?
Yes,
like,
very remote. Proper bush stuff. And so if you have even a periphery understanding of the Australian outback, you understand that it's a very remote, vast, beautiful, but also dangerous and scary place. So the following is what I wrote based very closely on, with very little creative liberty taken on his story. The sun was going down over the horizon, and Tyrese and his cousins sat atop the roof of their suburban house looking down over his neighbor's backyard. They sat there skipping stones onto the edge of their neighbor's property and talking to one another. His neighbors were holding a funeral service. They didn't know who the service was for, but their family was gathered in the backyard, grieving their loss. Disturbing the silence of the evening, they heard a movement behind them. Whilst telling the story, it was evident to everyone in the room that the mere recall of this memory was genuinely painful, His voice trembled as he spoke, as though he was going to burst into tears at any moment. They looked back, stunned to see an old woman climbing hastily up onto the roof. Once up there, the figure started sprinting with unnatural haste towards them. Terrified, they jumped off the roof and ran into the house to safety. Eventually, they get to sleep out of sheer exhaustion. The next morning, they are told by their auntie to go and pay their respects to the deceased. When they see the corpse in the open casket, they both immediately recognize it as a woman they had encountered the previous evening.
Holy shit.
Yeah, I know, man. The atmosphere in the room, man. Everyone totally had the goosebumps. It was a crazy thing to experience the retelling of, and from the first-hand encounter, not like a story you read on the internet. It was something else. I feel quite privileged to have experienced that, and this wasn't the only story he had, though. The second story he related takes place at his uncle's house in the afternoon, and he sees one of his uncles walking back to his house from a bountiful fishing spot with one large fish in his hands. He questions his uncle as to why he only caught one, to which he replies that you shouldn't take too many from the creek. Later, as the sun's coming down, he is walking down the same trail near his house when he sees another of his uncles returning from the same fishing spot with two large fish. He stops to talk to him, and, as they're speaking, his uncle suddenly looks startled, fixating on a point behind Tyrese. Turning around, he sees a black figure standing among the trees next to the trail. The two say nothing, but immediately turn, sprinting towards the house. Tyrese is the first to reach the house. He stands in the doorway, yelling at his uncle to get in. As he approached the doorway, they suddenly heard a snap sound. All that remained of the two fish in his hands were the heads he was carrying them by.
That is some scary stuff.
I know, but it also sort of highlights, I think, one of the interesting values that the Aboriginal people of this land hold is a sort of the deep connection to the land I was talking about earlier, that sort of manifested really, and people in these communities do take these ideas seriously. So whether or not you believe this story, personally, I believe he experienced it, although I don't know how the two fish could have disappeared, or the bodies of the fish could have disappeared like that. It reflects sort of a deeper cultural value, and I think that's something that a lot of scary stories, I guess you can get from them, is understanding of what the cultural values of that person are.
For sure, yeah.
The same could be said of Native American tales, especially old ones, and to me that had it almost seemed like a parable, that story.
Yeah, like an archetypal kind of very.
Yes, exactly. Something that one of those ancient stories, that's used to teach morality. This was framed as something that did actually occur to him, and I don't doubt it. So he relayed another story of a similar nature of when he and his cousins were out hunting kangaroos. They had just about finished their hunt, each of them having bagged a kangaroo for themselves, and were loading up their pickup truck with their harvest. As they drove away, they could see two black figures behind them in the rearview mirror on the horizon. They appeared to be gaining on them quickly. They couldn't make out what they were other than black splotches in the distance, but they were somehow keeping pace with the vehicle. They accelerated in an attempt to lose whatever it was, but still somehow managed to keep pace. Panicked, one of their cousins asked what the hell they had done. One of them confessed that in addition to the one kangaroo he had shot and killed another one. Frantically, they pulled to the side. The cousin hopped out and dragged a kangaroo carcass from the bed of the truck, tossing it to the side of the dirt road before hopping back in. the black figures disappeared and weren't seen again. So then you have also the sort of archetypical nature of it, like you were talking about, but sort of almost given a more modern framing, like with but yeah, this again was framed as something that actually happened to him. So yeah, and my other roommate.
Jesus.
Yeah, I know. Like the bush in general is like a really spooky place. Even for non-paranormal reasons, there aren't that many good reasons why you'd really want to go into the bush, like the deep bush proper. Like maybe for hunting, but even then, but like I guess to see the natural landscape. But it's just so incredibly dangerous from, and not even from like a. Australia has such dangerous animals, but like if you get lost, if you this seems to have been a constant across the last few episodes of basically if you get lost, you're in remote areas, you're basically just gonna die. So that was really interesting to me, and it left everyone in the room kind of a little bit stunned that night, and they actually didn't want to leave the room because they were the two uninvited guests. They were too scared to go back to their room, like make the journey back.
Jesus, don't blame them.
Yeah, no, I know. So yeah, and my other roommate.
That's some real like primal fear there.
I know, absolutely, like. And I tried the best I could to recreate sort of the atmosphere that was in that room at the time. But it's really something you can only fully experience firsthand. But I hope I was able to impart sort of a feeling at the time, at least.
Yeah, definitely.
So my other roommate proceeded to tell us about his experiences with sleep paralysis also, which I found quite interesting. And that basically had to do with also seeing like dark figures and that sort of thing. And which was interesting to me is that I only just realized this, but sort of the figure of a dark humanoid with no real discernible features other than being like dark is kind of a constant, isn't it? In terms of what people fear. Like I'm sure there's a logical explanation to that, but yeah. So
yeah. I used to get sleep paralysis a lot more than I do now. I still occasionally get it.
Didn't you say you get it still like once a week or so? Something like that?
Yeah, but I'm much more used to it now and know how to get like out of it. And,
what do you mean?
It's a creepy... Like, I'm usually... If I'm in sleep paralysis, I can usually wake myself up. Anyone who's done like lucid dreaming and stuff, there's certain techniques you can do when you're dreaming. If you realize you're dreaming, to wake yourself up, like spinning really fast or shaking your head really fast or different things. But not to get off topic, but
no, actually, go ahead. I think
there's like when you have sleep paralysis, there's definitely, not always, but usually this. Even if you don't see something, you can kind of like sense that there's like danger in the room. And
that's what my roommate also mentioned, that you just get, I've never experienced it personally, and for myself, I think I'm fortunate to have not experienced it, but he explained that he just would get a feeling, like he would wake up and he would get just this feeling of when it was about to happen. So yeah. Patrick, you're also quite experienced with like lucid dreaming, and you had quite an interesting dream experience just the other night, did you not?
Yeah, it was such a wacky I got stuck in this like cycle of dreams where I couldn't wake up, and I would think I had woken up, but I realized like after 20 minutes of walking around that I was back in the dream. And
wow. Like 20 minutes? Is that what it really felt like?
Well, time is a really weird thing in dreams.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I've heard that like most dreams in reality only last for around 3 minutes or something like that. I don't remember the exact figure. But yeah, certainly it's it feels a lot longer than it actually is in reality. But yeah, you were telling me this seemed like it just stretched on for days for you.
Yeah, and for some reason I had this like extreme thirst, and everywhere I'd go, I was trying to get like something to drink, but I couldn't. It was a real kind of creepy, like purgatory kind of
Yeah, that's like a
weirdness.
that's again like one of those primal like archetypical fears, isn't it?
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
and you said you felt like sorry that I'm explaining like your own story to you, but just recounting
Uh,
details I remember. Uh, you said you felt like hungover.
yeah, I felt like I just felt sick the whole dream, like hungover, like just this. Yeah, I can't. I couldn't really describe it other than that. Just kind of nauseated and just not good.
Right,
Like the opposite of a euphoria, like dysphoria.
right.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I'm glad I don't have that too often. Like, I experience some scary dreams, but oftentimes it's not that hard to, like, it'll happen once or
Hmm.
twice, I'll wake up, and then I'll be like, oh, whatever, it was just a dream, and whatever.
Hmm.
But I don't have the like, what do you call it, false awakenings? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, false awakenings or whatever.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, but
I've
you think
only
you've woken up.
experienced that once, and that was a pretty bizarre experience. This was actually pretty funny in a way. So I had a dream, and I don't remember what it was about. And then I had a false awakening that I was in my bed, and I got up from my bed and I went downstairs. I talked to my dad about the dream I had just had and how crazy it was.
Yeah,
That was
it
pretty
can feel
bizarre.
really real too.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
like
it really does feel completely real, and then you're left kind of baffled when you actually do wake up.
mhm.
Like, I guess
Yeah.
wondering if it's like the same scenario. But yeah, how many like false awakenings would you say you had in that single? Um,
I I wish I would have written down more because well, I remember the morning after this happened, I felt just like really odd. I was just thinking that was
mm.
a really weird
I
dream.
remember you wouldn't stop
I
messaging me about it and how unsettled you
Yeah,
felt
exactly.
by it for the rest of the day, pretty much. Like it seemed to have
Yeah.
been pretty shattering. Uh,
No,
like
I would probably say like a half dozen times. Like false awakenings like that can happen really quickly, rapid after another. It's like, oh, I gotta wake up. Oh, you think you're awake. Oh, wait, I'm still
yeah.
dreaming. Oh, better try again. And then you get sucked back into some dream. Something happens in the
So,
dream that you.
would you say this sort of thing has occurred more frequently since you started, like, because I know you're really into, like, lucid dreaming and, that sort of thing, or you do it a lot at least. You are able to, I
Yeah,
know, do things in dreams that and describe things going on in dreams that I've never been able to achieve. Would you say
yeah,
this is sort of a side effect of, uh, being able to do that your brain can sort of do this to you?
yeah. It's just like I used to get really bad sleep paralysis when I was young all the time. Like every time I'd go to bed at night almost. So
Wow.
you get used to like dream, and it's just interesting too to talk to these dream people who
Yeah.
are really like yourself. So you're talking to yourself. You're like subconscious in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, I was once quite amazed by what my subconscious was able to conjure up in a dream that was me sitting in a chemistry class, and I don't like chemistry, and um, and and then the teacher said something about like was teaching us chemistry, and from what I remember at the time, I don't think it was incorrect chemistry. And then the guy next to me, who was a guy who usually sat next to me in chemistry, who likes making dumb puns and jokes all the time. Really smart
Yeah.
guy, but he makes like a dumb joke, a dumb pun based on what the teacher just said, and I don't stop laughing for about 10 minutes. Like it felt like that.
Yeah,
that was probably one of the most surreal dreams I've ever had. But yeah, I
yeah.
thought that in itself, what you were talking about having that sequence of dreams was almost was pretty much almost enough to qualify for like a scary encounter. So yeah,
Hmm.
thanks for sharing
Speaking,
that.
I just remembered. I think I've told you about this before, but when I was like, it's probably one of my earliest memories. I must have been like four or something. I had this dream type thing where I was laying in my bed and I look up and this group of like four or five figures are standing over me, looking down at me. Uh, but they weren't very alien like. They were like from like scary movie type looking people. These are really
Right.
so I can understand where like abduction stories and stuff come from and
Oh,
go like
absolutely, yeah.
yeah,
Like, if you have an experience like that, then you could definitely, if you had a more active imagination and your brain was able to conjure up very
yeah,
lucid images of aliens, then I could imagine that's how it happens often.
yeah.
You also, I remember a story you told me of something to do with a closet when you were
Oh
younger.
yeah, yeah. Well, I just one time I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and I was like 10 years old, and I was pretty certain my closet was open, and I went to the bathroom, and then when I came back into my room, this is like in the middle of the night, I noticed my closet had closed, and it freaked the hell out of me. I friggin' ran like hell to my parents so quick.
Yeah, man. I remember that sort of thing happening. Well, not that specifically, but like
Yeah, just being
you're
spooked.
you're being spooked as a little kid and then running to your parents' room like so fast. I swear,
Yeah,
like if I was able to replicate today how like with such vigor I ran, I could probably qualify for like at least regionals in running, probably.
yeah, damn right. All that adrenaline, eh?
Yeah, man. So yeah, I think that about wraps up our discussion on spooky encounters,
Our
and we sort
lively.
of went on an
Yeah,
aside about dreams there, but I think that was pretty interesting anyway, and
yeah, it was good
productive.
anyway.
So,
Yeah.
thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next
Hmm.
episode. Bye.
Adios, amigos.